13, 2021, the 30th International Security Conference was held online in Krakow titled NATO US European Union, New Opening, New Challenges. A new transatlantic order rebuilding alliances, strengthening NATO. The conference was organized by the Institute of Strategic Studies, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and NATO headquarters. The introduction was given by Anna Szymanska-Klich, president of the ISS. She recalled that there has been a war in Ukraine since 2014, and the tension is with us all the time. Additionally, for several months, Poland is experiencing a hybrid operation on its eastern border, which is also the border of the EU. Against the background of the times of peace and prosperity in Europe, this is an exceptional situation, and there is a need to talk about rebuilding the European political order, or transatlantic relations. She also expressed the hope not to think twice in the near future, already over the growing tension in this part of the world. The representative of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Poland mentioned that when, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Poland and other countries in the region joined NATO and the EU, the geopolitical dilemma was dissolved. However, recent events also indicate that NATO should be stronger. Camille Grand, the honor guest, presented the keynote speech. He is an Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investments in NATO. He first mentioned the next summit in Madrid that had been scheduled at the end of June 2022. It was planned to adopt a new strategic concept, which is more likely to take into account the increasing risk of sides of China and Russia. Concern was expressed that China was expanding its nuclear system. They create new technologies and seek to undermine the global order. Besides, it is actively modernizing and trying to gain access to technology in the West. China, as well as Russia, spend more and more funds to acquire new technologies to outdo the West. There is also an illegal transfer of technology. For this purpose, NATO invests in startups and new technologies. In the fall of 2021, defense ministers adopted a special strategy on artificial intelligence. To this extent, NATO will also cooperate with the private sector. In the case of Russia, its actions are becoming more and more aggressive. NATO so far has been following the situation in Ukraine and Crimea. However, it is not excluded that even in this generation, NATO will have to make the greatest effort to protect its members. In this context, NATO's future strategic concept will include also issues of collective defense. As for Ukraine and its membership, NATO has not yet made a decision to speed up the process, but it is a close collaboration between them. After 2014, communication channels with Russia were maintained, in particular the Council. Nevertheless, after 2020, the situation of mutual NATO-Russia relations continues worsened, and now these relations seem to be the worst since the end of the Cold War. NATO also needs to meet other challenges, such as terrorism, pandemics, natural disasters, or the development of disinformation and propaganda. In the event of the climate change in the world, China should be an ally in this regard, not an opponent. In the new strategic concept, space will also play a very important role. Also, in the context of defense and deterrence, cooperation will also be important for NATO with partners such as Australia, New Zealand, or South Korea, and it will be important to define NATO's role in the Indo-Pacific region. So far, NATO is stepping up its presence in northern Kosovo to ensure freedom of movement within this country. NATO forces are also providing support for Iraq to support the government there in the fight against terrorism. In the case of Afghanistan, the decision to withdraw was not easy. But Afghanistan, it is not the last crisis in which we will have to act together. The key issue among NATO's priorities is also the partnership between states and organizations based on the principle of reciprocity and respect. In the first session, entitled Next NATO Summit, Political Unity as a Guarantee of NATO's Cohesion and Effectiveness, 4 speakers gave presentation. Heather Conley is president of the German U.S. Marshall Fund in Washington and director of the Center for Strategic and International Affairs for Russia, Europe and Eurasia. As she mentioned, NATO was already functioning during the Cold War, when it was counting initially 12 members in 1949, and now has 30 members. In the event that Russia violates the new treaties, it is relevant now NATO's response and how NATO will be united. It is true that the 30th anniversary of Russia-NATO relations will soon pass, but at the present time, the Kremlin seems to be rewriting the history of 3 decades. Unfortunately, in the West we do not currently have a generation that would be ready to understand the meaning of the history. At a time when Russia becomes stronger, NATO upholds the old Atlantic vision and a new one is needed as Atlantism. Mutual dialogue is needed, but the human factor must be taken into account. Creating a civil society, not delineating spheres of influence as Putin would like. As for deterrence, they should be strong, clean and transparent. Roland Freudenstein is vice president of the Globsec think tank based in Bratislava. At the outset, he reminded that during the martial law in Poland in 1981, no one was any more believed in communism. Regrettably, however, was the Social Democrats in West Germany. They considered the suppression of the uprising in Poland as an element of realpolitik. Helmut Schmidt, who is an Ostpolitik architect, took the position that since we have 2 blocks, 2 political systems, this cannot be done in either way to get around. When trying to draw some conclusions from history, it should be noted that the global context of events on the NATO-Russia line indicates an important one: the need to deter. It is about a certain ability, political and proper, will undertaken in a timely manner. As we understand it today, de-escalation is weakening the Western system of deterrence. There is nothing wrong with the fact that we conduct dialogue and talk. At present, however, such issues are discussed as whether NATO troops should be deployed in countries which could be attacked by Russia. Then support from NATO may be too late. In this context, it may be asked whether we are closer to 1914, when the war broke out anyway, or in 1938 during the appeasement policy. Sir Adam Thompson is director of the Pan-European team of experts from European Leadership Network. In his opinion, we should be careful in the matter creating strong political unity because we can redirect NATO in the wrong direction. Overestimating the meaning of unambiguity and consistency can be tragic. Consensus, on the other hand, is needed on the issue of creation a strategic concept to formulate effective action. In the name of taking up the really important matters, there may be political divergences needed because we do not want apparent coherence. NATO must seriously consider what modern deterrence should be like or collective defense. Even greater integration in arms control is needed, better communication, especially when it comes to making decisions. As for Russia, at least until 2014, NATO's strategic concept was consistent in this regard, but we do not have a unified strategy on China. We already have evidence that in creating the next strategic concept, NATO member states will likewise avoid responding to these the most difficult questions. Russia has facilitated NATO's affairs so much by causing it building consensus among its members. We are aware that the differences between Russia and NATO remain large. It cannot be reconciled. Dialogue is important, but it cannot be avoided either. Difficult topics. Professor Roman Kuznier, former advisor to the Polish Minister of National Defense and President of the Republic of Poland, recalled that the wisdom of the alliance comes from unity and cohesion. This understanding is derived from the concept of Clausewitz, the so-called center of gravity. In his opinion, Russia does not dare to use force against members of the North Atlantic Alliance. But after the Cold War, there were factors that could have undermined NATO's cohesion or effectiveness. For example, Article 2 of NATO deals with the strengthening of the institutions of free nations member states, and today we see that some member states are becoming less free, less democratic, also such as Poland. Russia is behaving predictably and is reinforcing the aforementioned tendencies. This applies to political forces in Poland, Hungary, but also in Western Europe, France, Italy. In December 2021 took place a meeting in Warsaw, grouping nationalist representatives from different European countries. Politicians such as Kaczynski or Orban should be asked to explain whether they still consider themselves part of the West, ready to stick to the criteria of Article 2.
Желтые беги по вышке и левее от нее 200!
Они идут на прорыв!
Желтые работайте по вышке! Алло, грады на РЛС, поняли, что я работал вечером? РЛС!
Давай!
Давай, бегом, Андрюша, просто как плотно!
І є те, що я хотів вам сказати. Слава Україні!